Hello, everyone. Welcome to the May 23rd edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk Meeting. I am Richard Brown. I never introduce myself in these things. I'm the head of community development at MakerDAO. We have an interesting call today. We have a guest from a product team, and Chris, correct me if I've gotten your department wrong. I'm not entirely sure what it is, but Chris from product is going to join us and talk about something that's near and dear to all of our hearts, and that is how the governance portal works now, but more so how it's going to work in the future, and solicit some ideas. So that's going to be interesting for us. Stephen is going to have a chat about how governance is an ecosystem, and then we're going to hand it off to risk, because we've been sort of shortchanging risk in the last few calls, and there's a lot to go over there. So I'm not going to monopolize or speechify today, which I'm sure lots of people will be happy to hear. No more or less so than the people in charge of the transcripts. Man, do I ever talk a lot. One thing I like to remind people is we're very, very interested in community feedback. The reason we have these calls primarily is to hear from the people that join these calls. So if you have questions, if you have comments, if you have suggestions, please do not be hesitant about sharing those with us. Type them in the chat at the side if you don't have access to a microphone. If you do have access to a microphone, please feel free to jump in and interrupt us at any point. I'm going to paste in a link in the chat to our subreddits. This is where we continue the discussions that we start in these calls. So in these calls, we don't make decisions. This is not a governance committee. This is where we debate things. We talk about important current events, memes, misconceptions, new trends in the ecosystem. We debate those a bit, and then we continue the discussion in the subreddit for the next week, and then we start making decisions around those things. I think that is going to be my preamble. I'm going to cut myself off there. So, Stephen, I'm going to hand this off to you.
Thanks, Rich. First, hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Before I get started, I want to thank everybody that approached me during the New York Blockchain Week. It was really, really quite cool to meet all of you guys. And there was one common question I was getting at the New York Blockchain Week, and I think it's very important, and that is, what the hell is that painting in the background? So I thought for a second, I'll just get out of the picture. There we go. Everyone can finally see it. Everyone can see it. I think Emmanuel and Pat Levesque specifically are now very happy with that little pause. But anyway, we're here to discuss something very interesting with respect to governance. There's an ecosystem that's developing around each stakeholder to the MakerDAO protocol. I mean, obviously, with respect to CDP users, with respect to DAI, I mean, DAI is effectively the on-chain economy, liquidity providers, but more so governance. I think it's one of those elements where you have a look at the scope of governance and ask very pointed questions about how do you organize yourself? How do you go about addressing certain issues and addressing certain items that you wish to consider as a group as opposed to as an individual. Now, to that point, what I would like to do is encourage people to self-organize and develop an ecosystem around governance. I think it's very important for this interaction to be consistently there, as I think it actually underlines the continuous approval system that is in place. So I think it does go hand in hand. So I would really welcome the community to explore everything from that organization through to tooling and considering dashboarding that could actually pertain to governance. And also keep in mind that any improvements to the tooling or dashboards or processes that you think could benefit the MakerDAO protocol, please talk out and please approach Rich, because we do have a grants program that can help with that. But the one thing I do want to reiterate is that no matter how you self-organize the ecosystem and how you wish to change it or provide tooling or dashboarding for the process, the one aspect you got to keep in mind is that the underlying scientific governance stays in place. The exposure to a plutocratic system is inherent to any kind of governance, but scientific governance with respect to MakerDAO helps, at least to the extent possible, minimize the risk of whales influencing the system. But given that, I need to go through the normal and typical disclaimers. The first one is that in this meeting we still have three themes that we consider: the demand and supply imbalance, collateral types, risk parameters in the portfolio, and obviously the third one being exogenous risks. This is decentralized scientific governance that we are trying to all together facilitate and actually work on it and provide momentum behind. So that's what this hour is dedicated towards. And also, finally, this is the constant reminder that governance is a continuous function. So please be involved as much as possible. So with that, I'm going to hand back over to Rich.
All right, thank you, Stephen. I think that there's an interesting dovetail here too that we can think about, because governance, from my perspective, and this is simply my perspective, it's not MakerDAO's perspective, but from my perspective, it's an extremely hard problem. It's a capital H hard problem in basically every discipline you can think of, including the crypto space. And one of the things that I personally have been wrestling with for a long time is how do we improve the mechanisms with which we use to conduct governance at MakerDAO, and how do we rely on the ecosystem to fill in some of those blanks. And I don't want to get into too much philosophy here, but there's an opportunity for us to continue with the same model that MakerDAO has sort of used with most of its tooling, is that the foundation creates crypto primitives, and those primitives are designed to be picked up by the rest of the ecosystem, and the DeFi space puts those things together in various combinations, and then we have an economy, and it's an amazing thing to watch. There's a potential here to look at governance from the same perspective. So we have a layer 1 version of governance, and let's call it layer 2, which is a portal where people can vote. And then there's all kinds of challenges that we see with stakeholders. And we've talked about those challenges in the past, about apathy and turnout, and people not knowing whether the maker makes a difference, or not knowing whether, and sort of casting about for, can I just give my maker to somebody else who does know how to vote? So a delegation mechanism. And as Stephen pointed out, there's an opportunity for the ecosystem to step up and start answering some of those questions for us. And we're really interested to see that happening. Which also provides me a really great segue introducing Chris Bradbury, who's in charge of figuring out the answers to a lot of these questions and providing us with the perfect solution, which I'm sure is coming very, very soon. No pressure, Chris. So why don't you introduce yourself, and then we can talk a bit about what we can expect in the portal in the future and how you guys are approaching that.
Yeah, cool. Thank you, Rich. And yeah, as you said, I'm Chris, part of the product team here, ultimately responsible for governance portal and the CDP portal mainly. At the moment, as you're all probably more than aware, the governance portal has been live around 8 months, I think, since we had our first foundation principles vote, and we haven't really touched on it since we released it really that day. It was simply designed for that governance proposal, the foundation proposal, which was a yes or no vote. And over this time, it's kind of governance has evolved a lot, and we haven't really kept up with that on the dashboard, mainly through MCD being a priority on this. But we're going to start looking at it now, and really what this is about really is actually just to request feedback from all of you who are using the governance portal every week, voting, and ultimately it's what do you want to see. I don't want to go into details now or necessarily hear all the feedback on this call, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop a post on Reddit just after I've finished, basically just outlining our plans, kind of some of the background and what we want to do moving forward. But just to give you a general idea of what we're looking at here is, you've probably seen over the last few weeks that we've obviously expanded polling from a couple of votes or a yes no vote in the very first vote to a couple of different options from a percentage increase point of view, to more recently, when DAO has become a little bit more stable, to 10 or 11 options. And the dashboard is ultimately completely broken. We've got a long list of options, and it's difficult to actually see all the options in one place. So the first step we're actually going to do is we're going to disconnect polling from executive voting from kind of behind the scenes, in the sense that We are at the moment polling uses DSG and it uses the same smart contracts under the hood basically. So we're gonna take that out, and with that we're going to redesign the entire UI. We're obviously super have a lot of knowledge of how governance works under the hood, and I don't think we're best placed to decide how that new UI should look, how it should work, and so on. So yeah, I want to hear from all of you really. What do you like in the current one? What don't you like in the current one? What would you really like to see? The new version of polling, we have quite a few of the requirements for, and we have a general idea of what we want to do with it, which involves ultimately just emitting events as opposed to actually voting on a particular contract. And with that, that expands the possibility of bringing in more than just MKR and so on to what kind of sentiment is out there. Ultimately, the goal though is to bring more people into governance and this governance process. We have, I think it's 8,000 or 9,000 unique MKR holders out there, and recently we had 194 unique addresses partaking in governance. So we want to grow that exponentially, kind of within the year really, and keep that growing more and more. And the more MKR we can get voting, or more unique addresses really we can get voting, is the kind of measure of success for us really. So yeah, so I'm going to drop a summary in the MakerGov subreddit. Please feel free to jump in the discussion there. I can't guarantee that all of the kind of feedback will be implemented into the new design, but what we're going to look for really is patterns in what people are asking for and what people want. And with those patterns, we'll put together some prototypes, and then hopefully in like 4 to 6 weeks, come back to this call with some prototypes, and we'll kind of do the same sort of process. We'll talk about them, we'll see what you think, and yeah, hopefully get as many of you involved as possible.
That sounds interesting. Well, yeah, I'm going to be the first one to jump in there, because I could potentially ask you about 27 different questions about governance and what the future of the portal looks like, and maybe that might be too much for this call. But I want to touch on something that you did mention. You said moving away from the chief to events, and one of the things that's one of the requests I get from the community frequently is, where do I see the data for previous governance activity? And my response is that we have a few different tools. The community is coming up with more. Dashboarding is coming, but ultimately that's a third-party ecosystem thing that we want to foster. And obviously, the next question is, okay, well, where do I find that data? So, in this new model that you guys are planning or architecting, will people still be able to find all the relevant activity on chain, or are they going to have to go to an API to get that?
No, so that's one of the crucial requirements we had when looking at this. Everything will still be on chain, so you'll still be able to analyze all the events and see all the events, and ultimately see what is being voted for. And yeah, and hopefully we're going to bring a lot more of that history into the new version as well. That's certainly one of our plans. Certainly a more detailed breakdown of what people have voted on. But yeah, everything's staying on chain, so it's still going to be fully auditable and immutable. So yeah.
What are the major highlights of the new features that are coming out? So obviously we have some restrictions in the existing model, and we've actually run into those in the last week. We knew that they were there, and this is the first time we kind of like hit them head on. And one of those is that the executives have the continuous approval voting means that we can have potentially a weak executive vote sitting in the system that never gets ratified, or it doesn't get ratified before the next poll starts, which is a problem. We're running into a new problem this week where the new executive is not going to get ratified until prior to the new executive coming into the system. So I'm actually not entirely clear on what the mechanism there. I'm assuming we just swap out the old unsuccessful executive with the new unsuccessful executive. Is that true?
Well, actually, I think it's probably a discussion point for this call, actually. So kind of on the specific of the executive vote, I think the executive vote is the same as the winning poll this week. So because it is continuous approval voting, there is no dates or anything attached. So ultimately, we can just leave the executive vote, carry it on basically at 17.5%.
Yeah.
So really the suggestion there is just to leave that as it is. Onto your point of, multiple votes happening at one time. That's the primary driver for changing it right now. At the moment, we can only have one vote going on realistically at any one time, whether that's polling or executive. With the new system, we can have as many polling votes happening at any time, and you'll be able to vote on 5 polling votes at once if you'd like to. You'll still only be able to vote for one option within each poll, but you will be voting. Yeah, you could have, for instance, a cadence poll at the same time as having a stability poll, at the same time as maybe proposing new collateral types to add to the system. And it won't matter if they're overlapping at all. You'll be able to go in, you'll be able to read them, you'll be able to vote. Likewise, if there's something happening in the core system on the executive side, you'll still be able to partake in that with the same knowledge that there's no votes or MKR from one to the other, like we saw in the last week.
Well, that's okay. So that's where I guess I'd assume a lot of the complexity comes into things, because right now it's dead simple, because that MKR gets locked and we know where that MKR is and we know who owns that MKR. What mechanism are you guys going to be using to have people voting on like 5 votes at a time plus an executive? Like, is there some kind of an IOU token involved, or snapshotting, or?
Ultimately, it's snapshotting. So we'll probably take. It's not been fully decided, but I suspect we'll take the kind of final block at the end of the poll as a snapshot of everybody's balances. And when you emit an event, you're ultimately just emitting your address that you're voting with and the option you want to vote for. So at that block where the poll ends, we will then take the balances of all the available like known contracts that we have, plus your wallet balance. So if you've got MKR locked into a vote proxy and locked into Chief and locked in and just held in your wallet, we'll actually sum all of those balances up and add that to the running total of the MKR on that poll. One of the crucial things for us as well, though, is to actually enable the UI for people to be able to see kind of what that tally might look like. Unless, of course, there's these options where actually it might be better to have hidden results until the end, where you don't actually know what's going on until the end. And I'm hoping a discussion forms around that point. But yeah, we'll be using an archive node of some sort to keep tally for the UI if we need to.
Well, that leads into another question I was going to ask. So are you guys primarily looking at things from a user experience perspective and additional feature sets perspective, or are you also contemplating things like putting requirements or refining how governance works? Are you talking about thresholding and upper and lower bounds on particular types of votes, or medians between different polling options? Are you looking at any kind of deep mechanisms like that, or is it just UI and UX?
At the moment, it's just more of a UI UX thing, from a goal really of just increasing the amount of people coming in. I think one thing we learned a lot from the last vote was that, or the very first vote, the foundation proposal, is we don't really know what's going to happen in the next 12 months. I think some of the requirements we had, that it would only ever be yes or no votes in polls, was one of the first things we talked about, and that quickly changed. Unfortunately, the system we used enabled us to be able to do that. But like, if you ever look at Chief now, there's just a ton of like blank spells basically in Chief that just say signal your support for X. They just get used to that 3-day period and then they're never used again.
I think one of those additional requirements, specifically around yes and no's, is that it's become apparent that one of the major use cases for the portal is picking a range of numbers in an easy way. Is that something you guys are playing around with, like paradigms for?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, the kind of very short-term solution to get away from this issue with the dashboard, the kind of long dashboard, is actually we're just gonna have the kind of headline title on the dashboard, and hopefully this change will happen in the next 4 to 6 weeks as well. But kind of ultimately the headline title on the dashboard, and you'll click into it to go into the actual proposal. And instead of having 11 proposals, there will simply now just be one proposal and something like a drop down to choose which vote you want to choose, and then a vote button.
Yeah, that'd be nice.
In slightly longer, so the full like redesign that we're looking at, we're open to all sorts of options. And one of the things I'm thinking about is, even when we create the poll, is actually able to choose the input option type. So whether that's a drop down or a slider or whatever you think, right? Like that's where the feedback's going to be so important, because I think we've got some ideas. Rich, I know you've got a lot of ideas, but we're so deep ingrained in this. I think the most important ideas are from people that just use it ultimately twice a week, like Monday to Wednesday, then on a Friday, ideally. So yeah, it's just a call really to get involved as much as possible in the next 2 weeks. I think there's been a couple of questions about wireframes and so on in the thing, in real-time board and so on. We're actually using a product called Notion at the moment, which we can share publicly. So as we move on, we can drop some things into Notion, and then yeah, I can add things into Reddit or drop them to Rich to share with the community.
All right, that sounds like a good place to wrap things up. So let's make sure that we clarify what people can do to get involved. So you're going to be posting something to Reddit, soliciting feedback, and is there going to be a form or something where people can interact, or is there going to be adding stuff to that thread, or how do you want to solicit those suggestions?
For this one, it's more I'm looking just for kind of discussions within the threads in Reddit. What I'd quite like to see is kind of background and not evidence as such, but a reason why you might want something. So just kind of 2 words of saying like bigger buttons is probably not that helpful to us, but yeah, kind of a reason why. And then ideally where a discussion can take place, which will help us understand the actual demand and reasons for actually doing it.
I think that sounds good. So we can iterate on this thing a bit and then maybe get you back in a couple of weeks to talk about next steps or what the progress looks like. Is that an idea?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And then if there are any individuals that would rather and would be up to do like a one-to-one session after these next 2 weeks, then that would also be great as well, that we can take individuals through the portal and actually let them use it or use a prototype and kind of point out in individual bits that they maybe find confusing or can't actually see what to do.
All right, sounds good. All right, is there anything else you wanted to leave us with, or are we good?
No, that's something. That'd be great.
All right, that's awesome. It sounds like you have some work to do back there, so I'm going to let you go. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, cheers. Thank you.
All right, well. All right, Cyrus, I'm going to let you pick it up because we ate up another 25 minutes and we need to get into risk, so off to you.
Sure. Vishesh, are you on the line to go through the pack?
Yeah, I can do that. All right. Okay. So just as far as what's been going on lately, let me just start with DAI, actually. So what's been interesting, this is a new kind of viewer.
Are you sharing your screen?
I am. Are you not able to see it?
We do not see it yet.
Okay. Okay, are you able to see that?
No, not yet. You might have to kill one of your monitors.
Damn, that's the saddest thing I ever heard.
Yeah. I'm imagining you with like a 25 monitor setup. And some.
It's like not wrong at all. I'll just kill Safari entirely. It's not just multiple monitors, it's multiple browsers as well.
Do you have the option to like share a window when you click down there?
Yeah, I was doing that. Sorry for the technical delay. Okay. How about now?
Negative.
Okay.
This is highly disappointing.
I noticed your graph's got a new URL.
They did.
Decipher.io, right?
Yes, I updated the URL so it's a little bit more official. Okay, I'm just going to unhook the monitors here. Back to doing it old school. Apologies for that. Don't usually have an issue.
It's kind of sorry to see that we lost the Visa Vishesh branding.
You still got me on Twitter.
Yeah.
All right, how are we doing? Can you see it?
No, it might be thoroughly confused. Maybe if you like leave and then
reload.
If you just drop off. We could do other things while we wait, though. Matthew, did you want to have a chat today? We can
Sure.
get into that while we're waiting. All right, sure. You want to kick it off?
Yeah, so basically this is just kind of a continuation from the call, I guess, from last week, where some people asked me, let me just go ahead, now I'll try and present. Let me know if that works. Anybody?
Nope.
All right, there's an issue with Google then.
Yeah,
anyway.
likely.
Yeah, so this was more related to the iterations between the stability fee and the DSR. Some people kind of reached out to me and asked, basically, kind of fast forward the video of where we are today before a DSR and where we'll be in 2, 3, 5, 7 years, kind of what we're going to look at. And it's manually we're going to be having from a governance level, we're going to be going back and forth on what happens when you lower the stability fee and trying to identify the signal of lowering the stability fee, then increasing the DSR, and iterating over and over and over, basically a human version of a PID, but without the I and without the D, just the P, the proportional. Basically, if die is above 1, what do we do? And building out that matrix of decisions that we all basically as a group agree is the fundamental decision making you should do to help stabilize die back down to $1. And the interesting thing becomes, as we get through that point, there will be, whatever that turnover point where the DSR kind of, not asymptotes, hits a derivative of 0, where it starts to arc over, where we find not necessarily the sweet spot, but the point where we have a meaningful direct change, a controlling change in the amount of die that's issued once the DSR, we can start to lower it and also at the same time also bring down the stability fee at the same time. Once we get to that window, we're going to find, this iteration process will continue, basically bouncing back and forth. This, again, is not a week of work. It's not a month and it's not a year. It's a couple of years to get that. The challenge, again, becomes this is still just the P. All of that is just human inputs. And, if we can imagine, we can all probably draw on a sheet of paper, there are 5, 9, 10 scenarios that we can all fundamentally agree, or what is the logic right now? The question is right now is how do we identify the difference between going between 19.5% to 17.5%, but why wasn't 17.37 picked as an example, right? And it's just right now we're just using logical guessing, reasonable logical guessing to determine that. And a lot of those decisions are going to be outside the scope of what we as people can identify. We have something directly unique that central banks don't have any access to, which is we have constant, immediate access to the amount of supply that is issued and what happens to it on a minute-by-minute basis. Same thing whenever we have a DSR, we'll have the reverse of that, of knowing how much is locked up and what that does to the price. Now, all that data is, I kind of mentioned this on the last call, we're gonna want at some point to implement a PID. The question is really where, and some of the challenges, and I kind of chatted with Vishesh about this offline also, would be some of this is very similar to the way, like we mentioned, an auto driving car or truck just generates an amazing amount of data for a 25-hour drive, or 24-hour drive, like 5 terabytes of data. And, they have to have, we need to ultimately find a way to rip through that data to do some type of deep learning to identify what would be the best ways over time. This is not a small engagement to identify. Imagine we had a scenario, let's call it, one or, doesn't matter, 100 scenarios or more, where, as an example, if die is above 1, but it's trending up with a slope of X, but the supply is coming down with a slope of Y, what historically have we done? What historically do we recommend? And then how do we get that information into a blockchain? Because the blockchain isn't going to process that. Or more specifically, it could process it, but it's way too slow. And burning gas to do that will be way, way, way too expensive. So that kind of deep learning we're going to need to be able to iterate on an optimized level is how we're going to ultimately pull this target sweet spot, the overall stability fee, down from, it'll go below 10 when we have the DSR, but getting it to, to plant and to stick below 4 or 5, we're going to need algorithms to help us get there. The challenge, again, will then be, how do we set it up such that the system can't be gamed? It can be gamed, but how do we set it up so that it can't be attacked? I mean, maybe the answer is, and these are just me speculating, again, I'm not stating what we will do or what we must do. This is ignorance is bliss. The concept of just external computation and how we bring that, ID component on chain, probably through some type of oracles, distributed oracles, same way we do with pricing. Anyway, that was the main takeaway from that. Some people asked about was how many iterations would it take to get there, and will that be a simple, smooth line? And absolutely it won't. And we will absolutely joyfully hit the black swan that nobody expects. And what scenarios, how much of that will manipulate our data? So,
well, that raises a good point. Thanks for that, Matthew. That was great. About how willing we are to trust algorithms and what that transition looks like. And I think that as a group, perhaps, and Cyrus, and anybody can correct me if I'm wrong, but we're moving towards this picture where we had to do things manually until we understood basically the broad strokes of how managing risk parameters work. It's inevitable that we need to have an algorithm somewhere that's crunching a great deal of data and providing some signals for us, and that will transition into this stage where we vote on parameters based on what the models are telling us at any one moment. And then potentially at some point in the future, we'll be able to take our hands off the wheel a bit and let those models, sandbox those models, but let them basically drive some of the decision-making process. Is that accurate, Cyrus? Is that still kind of
maybe in the super long term? I mean, I think using models is fine, but I'm very, very hesitant to have any sort of on-chain algorithm set our parameters for us.
Even if they were bounded, probably very tightly.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need that human gut check for a number of years to come. It seems so many ways it can go wrong.
Yeah, that kind of ties into this larger, I guess, philosophy, and I suppose that ultimately this needs to be governed by humans. That needs to be the final arbitrator. And so we're balancing engagement with the system and potential apathy and all of the concerns about plutocracy and all the rest of those things that go along with governance. On one side, that's one of the major cons. And the other major con on the other side is machines don't care about humans, and they'll do whatever machines are told to do. And so having an algorithm go haywire is...
I mean, I think there's also a manipulation aspect to it, right? If you know exactly how the algorithm that's setting your parameters works, I'm pretty sure you can back out the cost to manipulate it up to a certain number.
That's an interesting, there's precedence here too, and it happens a lot with different organizations I speak with, is that the people come out with an algorithm, or they come out with a bot or a keeper or some kind of mechanism. And then they're successful for about 3 months until a ninja notices that there's chances, opportunity for either exploit and or profit, and then they rapidly get pushed out of that market that they've created for themselves. And I think that same model applies here, that even if we did have a complex algorithm that was that we liked and that was capable of managing the system, it's impossible to predict that black swan genius that might come in and start playing with our inputs. Right?
Yeah, or maybe something as simple as a human veto, as Josh said in the chat, could be good enough.
I might suggest maybe slightly the opposite of a human veto, where it's just the human pushing the button, and then there's sort of maybe a recommendation is a good spot to work towards, right? Where we have an algorithm that's recommending a certain change or a certain amount, and that's just an input that we take into account in pulling the trigger, at least for the medium term, I would say. Maybe long term we can really get to kind of this point, but to me the whole PID model is more of an ideal to work towards as a broader process. So with the PID thing, I think there's two major problems that we have to solve. One is, what are the right inputs? And then two is, how do we properly respond to those inputs? And a PID algorithm is mainly about how do you respond to those inputs. I think we are squarely in the stage of discovering what those inputs should be. Even from the process of me manually running 20 models on the weekend, it's really hard to figure out what the right variables are, and you kind of have to explore and investigate. And it's a really human process. Right
Actually, I don't want to put you on the spot, Vishesh, but do you want to talk a little bit about that, about your research into the right inputs and how difficult that's been, and maybe some of the challenges?
Yeah, I haven't published more about this because it's been more difficult, and I haven't gotten to like really good concrete answers, and I want to like make sure I get to those before I start sharing stuff. But the basic idea is, I got asked a lot, like, what is driving DAI price? What's driving, what's the impact of the stability fee? Really like seemingly simple questions. And the answer was often, it depends, right? And the latest like bull run or crypto spring, as my poll is indicating, is really kind of challenging a lot of those assumptions and relationships. Like most of the correlations that I found running up through end of April completely broke in May. And that's something that we really need to take into account, is to what extent are the environmental conditions that we're envisioning, like in terms of what's going on with crypto in general, what's going on with Tether, what's going on with ETH price, just how impactful they are for like what happens to the system. We can't simply look at the correlation between stability fee and DAI supply. You can get to an okay correlation if you like filter out a lot of those external factors, but that's just not realistic. So yeah, it's extremely challenging to find good regressions with solid, R-squared values that like seem to have, random residual plots, because there are underlying patterns there that are just not being taken into account because there's variables we're not taking into account. And so like, for example, I had initially, like my first stupid rough pass was to try to run a lot of regressions on ETH price and DAI price. And like, I was getting okay correlations, but the point was I was really missing this concept of like DAI price is not a monolith. And I was missing this concept of, ETH price is relative, right, to people's perception. So just because ETH price is low, it doesn't tell you anything. Is ETH price low relative to where people expect it to be long-term? That's a really different variable that has a stronger correlation. And then, it's still an iterative process, right? So I've gotten to better correlations now than I did 2 weeks ago, but they're still not good enough in my opinion.
Yeah, I think we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, right? Trying to forecast the demand for leverage at various price points.
Yeah, and not even forecast, but just explain current levels. And then forecasting is like a level up.
We have about 15 minutes left, Vishesh. Do you want to try a screen share again? I think if we all manually just click on the screen share, it works, but it's not going to take over for us.
Yeah, I think, and I don't know if Google updated something, but there's another screen that pops up, which is me as well, but my presentation. And so if you click on that, you should be able to see the screen. Yeah. If anyone has any problems with that, let me know.
No,
works for me.
Okay, so I'll try to go through this a little bit quicker. So basically, this is a new view that for most people won't have seen in terms of a breakdown of what's been going on with DAI price in the last 24 hours. And I've kind of been checking and monitoring this over the past week or so. I think broadly, DAI has been hovering just above and just below $1, right? Which is, to me, proper functionality for DAI. There should always be, I think, this kind of bell curve-y distribution above and below. I think you almost always see kind of this skew where there's more trades below $1 than above $1, even if it's like potentially centered on $1. And I think that makes a lot of sense, particularly in terms of what we were talking about, this being a fairly asymmetric system where when DAI starts trading above $1, it's very quick and easy for the system to arb that down a little bit. And so there's always going to be kind of this more dramatic cutoff above $1. But broadly, you can see the volume weighted average price in the last 24 hours is like $1.002. So that to me is broadly reasonable. Some people have kind of commented the most recent trade sometimes is below, but that tends to balance out over time. Like you have to filter out for some of the noise. So this is the challenge with looking at more and more real-time data, especially with something like DAI with really low liquidity, is you start to introduce a lot of noise to the system, which is why in the past, I've preferred much more so to look at like a longer running volume weighted average. So just to hop over, oh yeah, and so volume has come up a little bit, but it's still like relatively low levels. You know, we saw, you know, a little over a week ago, some huge volumes. And so let's jump over to that.
Before you move on, Vishesh, can I
Yes.
ask, do you think this is because inventory levels have been cleaned out, or is there some other mechanism at working?
This being the volumes, or
Yeah.
no, I think it was just like long term. This is, I think, a fairly reasonable volume for DAI. Like DAI volume has always been kind of low, but it was just a crazy spike and in a very atypical time period that was happening a little over a week ago. And so I will actually look at that on the longer running chart. So, you know, as you can see here, like you see that insane spike in volume as opposed to the more long term. So what's interesting is as the stability fee has come up, the DAI price in like a volume weighted average basis has come up a bit as well. I don't want people to just necessarily think it's as simple as that. But looking in the last couple of weeks, you saw, again, this crazy spike that I've been talking about. This was a lot of people, you know, as we actually got to touch on last week, this was a lot of people clearing out debt, a lot of people kind of coming full circle from leveraging up on ETH to cashing out on some of those profits, buying back a lot of DAI. So this kind of spike in volume was, to me, a lot of people purchasing DAI. Now, there was a big open-ended question last week, which is what are people going to do with this DAI? And everybody was thinking, oh, you know, DAI is trading 2-3 cents above $1. Everything is perfect now, and we should lower the stability fee. I had suggested that that was maybe a little bit premature, and we shouldn't act on kind of these really short timescale trends, which appears to be the case because this is kind of leveled out a bit. But it has been hovering above and below $1. So that is, to me, saying that with the current levels of DAI held and being traded, with the current stability fee, with the current overall outstanding supply, and with ETH price holding fairly steady, we're actually at this kind of equilibrium point where DAI is operating normally. So this is really good. I think this is a good data point for us to have in the bank because now we have a frame of reference for understanding what DAI looks like in a quote unquote normal scenario.
Sorry, can I interrupt you again, Vishesh?
Yes.
Is this something that we should probably call out regularly in these calls, in these meetings, is to try and figure out what the proper cadence is and what kind of like a tail of data is required before we start making decisions? Is this because this kind of implies that like if we don't wait a week, we're not really going to know with any kind of confidence what happened, right?
Yeah, so, and I know you've asked me that question before, kind of trying to lead me into a trap and give you a concrete time frame. But what I will say,
for me.
I will never purport to do that. But what I will say is a week is definitely too short. Like we cannot make significant monetary policy decisions on what happens to the price within like a 3 or 4 day period. That to me seems a little bit ridiculous.
I mean, on the flip side, though, we were making them when the DAI price was weak. We were raising them every week.
Yeah, but I don't think that was a week-to-week response, right? That's different. That's not us saying that something happened within the course of a week and now we're going to make a change because of that. That was us looking at a long-term trend and saying we know by a wide margin that we're below where we need to be, and so let's continue to make increases on a relatively weekly timescale, which is two different things in my opinion.
Yeah, that's one of the things I've been concerned about from ever since activity in the governance system ramped up, is that we might get lulled into thinking that this is the new normal when it might not be, and that we should continuously evaluate what cadences make sense, I think.
Yeah, so I think that's the constant balance that we're managing here is more time is our friend and it helps us understand how trends kind of level out. But at the same time, if we know we're not in the place where we need to be, inaction can be bad for very obvious reasons. So it's definitely a balance we have to continue to manage. What I would say is if we're looking at longer term data trends and making actions on that, that makes sense. If we are responding to intra-week events and making monetary policy changes on that, that does not make sense. And I think like at the current amount of information that we have. That's probably about as much as I'm like willing to conclude, but I'm sure we'll learn more as we go along.
All right, thanks for that.
Yeah. So kind of look at ETH price and DAI price. And there's a number of different lines here that people can play around with. The gist was what's been happening to kind of a slightly smoothed out, longer weighted average of DAI and ETH price. So what's really interesting here is in the past, there had been a stronger correlation, as I mentioned, inverse to what's been going on with DAI and ETH price. Recently, that has become much more correlated, you know, the course of this month. So that's kind of broken the model a bit, which to me says that there's a deficiency in the model. And so what my suspicion is I need to get a lot more refined on how we think about ETH price short versus long term. And like maybe there's two models here. One, like what does DAI do in a bull market situation? What does DAI do in a bear market situation? Because those clearly seem to be different things. And I think it makes a lot of sense, like intuitively, if you think about it, because you know, in a market where DAI is, where ETH is trading cheap relative to where people think it should be, they're going to lever up, and DAI price is going to suffer, and so there's going to be kind of this inverse relationship. In a market where people have already done that, and now they're just cashing out on that ETH, they're trying to run away with a 40% profit or a 30% profit. And so they don't really care about taking a 1% to 2% haircut if DAI is trading above $1. And so in that scenario, you can actually maintain this kind of positive correlation. And so what we need to do is expand our view so that we have, you know, a more comprehensive model that can explain both of those situations, and which we haven't really been doing up till now because we haven't really seen this kind of positive relationship very much. And so I think that's what I'm saying, where we get to see a lot of different types of environmental conditions. We learn more and we can refine our models and get better at describing what the hell's going on.
So sorry, Vishesh, I keep on interrupting you, but there's something interesting that just came out there. So you're saying that in a bull, we don't have to be super responsive with lowering the fee. But in a bear, we should be fairly responsive in raising a fee. Is that the takeaway?
Yeah, I mean, it's I think that's fair. And what I will qualify is it's like the bull through the China shop. You know, in the bull market, there's such a strong signal that is kind of wiping out any sort of cost. So there's this calculator that I shared a while back in terms of what's the profitability of leveraging on ETH. Like that depressive effect on DAI price of maybe some people are levering up and they are selling DAI is so outweighed by just the pure transaction value of people cashing out into DAI that you'll lose all other signals. It'll just be overwritten, and you'll never know what the hell's going on the other side of the equation because all you see is the strongest signal.
So euphoria in a bull blurs the signals, and fear in a bear kind of clarifies them a bit.
Yeah, all that adrenaline, we don't know what we're thinking.
Interesting. All right, thanks.
Do you think that there's like a built-in bias in the market to like just make it really hard to lower the stability fee? Because I think that like, do you think it's possible to basically have an artificially high stability fee while still seeing DAI behaving like it's at an equilibrium point, when in reality the equilibrium point might be like a broader range of stability fee?
Well, so there's definitely like a concept of a like a local equilibrium versus a global one, right? So you can have local versus global maximum. So the idea that, and I think this is a really good example for what's going on right now. It's possible that what we're dealing with is a local equilibrium and not a global one. Because as I mentioned, there were a lot of people that cashed out on kind of this full circle leveraged ETH position. And so those people, and what I wanted to get to was what's going on with burns and wipes, burns and draws, because those people might be sitting with DAI, which means whatever they do next in the long term might move the equilibrium. So even though right now we might be stable, it's possible for their next action, which is actually just a reaction in a longer time scale, to move that equilibrium and potentially break us off of it. And so then it's really a semantic discussion of like, do you consider that to actually have been an equilibrium or not? I don't know, I can't answer that for you, but what I can say is it's entirely possible that right now we are stable, but just that kind of full circle swing of what had been going on with leverage has yet to conclude, and we might yet move off that equilibrium.
Yeah, where we might be in the eye of the storm.
Yeah, that's a fair metaphor.
I'm hesitant to draw too many conclusions from the bear market of last year, because we were at the same time seeing this massive expansion of DAI supply as MakerDAO was just kind of hitting the limelight and getting popular. I mean, I wouldn't expect another exponential growth in the DAI supply if another ETH bear market hits like we did last year. So everything around the stability fee mechanics is almost useless to me, I think, from a data perspective.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that's totally fair, and I don't think I'm necessarily making a lot of conclusions based on what happened, over a year ago. But I'm mainly talking about like what are kind of the trends in the last, I don't know, let's say 6 months.
Got it.
So sorry, I just want to make sure we get through a lot of the important info. So supply has been coming down in the past few weeks, fairly consistently. I had all these prepped, but I reloaded the page. So yeah, you can see here, there were a few like major burns, and I kind of tweeted about this. May 16th was a oddly eventful day. So what we saw actually was shortly after the 19.5% raise, supply had been coming down. There was this weird little run up and then immediately precipitously drop back down. So what I can say is the flywheel is moving and circulation of debt is very strong. So this is a really interesting metric to see. I think it's one of the most important, most underrated metrics about Maker is just how quickly is debt circulating through the system. So this was just a tremendous amount of churn. What we saw, I can't necessarily explain why there was this run up in supply, but what does make a lot more sense is that supply then significantly dropped as a lot of people were paying back debt with newly acquired DAI, newly purchased DAI. Like that made a lot of sense.
Is that from a single large holder, or is this some kind of group?
I think this was, and I'm forgetting now, but I think this was a cluster of large transactions.
Oh, that's interesting.
But
yeah, that was also CDP 5199. They burned like $2 million in one day, 2 million DAI.
That's something to keep in mind too, is that some of the times we're looking at trends, and these trends represent a single person doing a single thing, right?
Yeah, 3228 also scaled out. He's like at like 50,000 DAI debt now.
Yeah, and anecdotally as well, there have been a lot of reports of sort of refinancings from Maker to other platforms. So that, naturally has an associated dip in supply. So just to actually touch on that real quick, because we only have a couple minutes here. So this is what I was talking about in terms of the circulation of debt. The age of debt has just dropped precipitously in the last few weeks. Again, this is sort of around that May 16th period has just been coming down, which is, I think, really good. So if there's more debt circulating through the system, there's more realized fees, there's less accrued outstanding fees, and that's just a healthier state because there's less of a disparity between what's on the surface and what's underlying in the system. And just to touch on the secondary lending rates, so there's kind of this healthy buffer, I think, that's been maintained of around 3% between Maker and secondary lending platforms. Dharma is a bigger spread, but those are subsidized, so it's really hard to say what the actual rates would be without subsidies. And I know that's a conversation that's been discussed before. It's been suggested that we look at things like Nuo as well, but there have been a lot of issues with Nuo lately, so I'm fairly comfortable just looking at Compound as like the most reliable signal at the moment. And so similarly around that May 16th period, what we saw was kind of a drop in the rates because there was a corresponding drop in borrow volume. So as fewer people, which is really interesting because it kind of flies in the face of the narrative that people were refinancing onto something like Compound. So Dharma also didn't really experience a huge change in volume. So I'm not really sure where those people were potentially refinancing to, or if they just completely exited their loan positions. It's really hard to say what people are doing on other platforms or outside of Maker. I'm going to skip over this for now. Collateralization ratio, so just in that same time period, a ton of ETH was removed, which makes sense because a ton of DAI was removed. So why would people just keep ETH sitting? But the collateralization ratio has been running up and been holding fairly steady, which I think, again, is a metric to watch because it speaks to the idea that people want to maintain this buffer, which means they're still potentially worried about a drop in ETH price. So I think people are fairly neutral on ETH right now. They're not really levering up. They're not really clearing out their collateral. They're just kind of waiting to see what happens next. Okay, I think that's time.
All right, I want to jump in super fast. We're at the top of the hour. I think that there's more cool conversations to be had, so I'm willing to hang out for another half hour if everybody else is. I think that we could probably just leave it there. So if we want to have a freeform Q&A, please hang out. Back to you, Vishesh and or Cyrus. Vishesh or Cyrus?
I'm happy to answer questions if people have them.
Yeah, same.
Is there anything in the side chat that didn't get addressed?
Yeah, I think there was a question about one of Vishesh's graphs about the correlation coefficient. Where was it?
Guillermo, which graph were you referring to? I'm assuming it's ETH and DAI price.
Yeah, I think it was the ETH and DAI price graph when that question was asked.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that I've mentioned prior on one of these calls is ETH and DAI price correlation is not so great. I forget, I think it's around 0.4 or something, but DAI and ETH ratio of short-term price to long-term price is stronger. I think that's above 0.5, but with the caveat of in the last few weeks that correlation has really come down. So that's why I really have not felt comfortable sharing that more publicly, is just because I don't feel it's a robust enough model yet to explain what's going on.
Fair enough.
All right, well then I'm going to jump in there with a random question then. I'm not sure where I got this idea from. It was somewhere, I saw something on Twitter or it was Reddit, but the question was asked if there is a logical lower bound on what the stability fee can be in light of all these alternate lending platforms out there. Like is it possible that it's never going to make sense to go below 10% or 8% once the industry sort of determines what the most common lending rate is?
So this question was posed, it's been posed on these calls, it's been posed on Twitter, like how do we look at the relationship between the stability fee and secondary lending rates? I want to caution people from using the secondary lending rates as a target for stability fee, even with like a built-in buffer. It is a good input to understanding what's going on as a response to the existing stability fee, but you just get into a very screwy feedback loop if you start to use it as a target. And I know we've talked about that before. As far as like what happens if we start lowering the stability fee, and is there like a realistic floor there, and can we discern that floor from other platforms? Sure. If you start to look at what's on those other platforms as a floor, that does make sense, because if you lowered the stability fee down to at or below what's on some of those other platforms, you get it back. You get us back into some earlier economics that we were in, which was kind of screwy, where people are highly incentivized to just draw out DAI and lend it, or to refinance loans from other platforms back onto Maker. Neither of those things are good for the system, I feel. But that's when we're talking about the floor. There's a lot of bad things that can happen between here and the floor, I think is the point. And so sure, we can think about what the floor is, but I don't even think that's the right discussion to have. I think what we're doing now in terms of what's the right level to be at as a target is a much healthier discussion. And I think naturally Maker should be the most expensive. Like it should be the lender of last resort because it's the easiest place to get a loan from. Maker will always lend you out DAI, no matter what.
Well, unless the debt ceiling's hit.
Yeah, that's fair. And then we get into some even more complex economics, but I think we're in a bad spot if we hit the debt ceiling, in my opinion.
It's interesting how those conversations around debt ceilings have sort of dried up.
What about when if Maker's always lender of last resort, do these secondary markets, that doesn't quite make sense because the secondary markets are always going to have to be more expensive on fees than Maker. Otherwise, the lenders aren't making any money, and it has to be subsidized somehow else.
Yeah,
like Dharma is.
But that's assuming that the lenders on those markets are sourcing their DAI from CDPs on Maker. They might as well, they could just be buying it on the spot market with their own capital and like deploying it completely independently of Maker.
And I think you would want that happening too, right? So if those people are incentivized to buy up DAI, that helps to support the price floor on DAI.
And it also could be just a short-term phenomena altogether. I mean, at the end of the day, Maker, which mimics a central bank, it basically is a central bank that has a retail book of clients, thus circumventing, mitigating, removing retail banks. And the question is, why would a person put money in a retail bank to earn what they could earn directly from a central bank?
Are you talking about the DAI savings rate now too as well?
Not even that. I mean, it's more of just the stability fee as a whole. I mean, I don't want it to date poorly, but we may find that the whole secondary market is just a short-term phenomenon.
I mean, I think that's totally possible, and I think there are definitely some parts of it that are not going to stay the way they are. Like if you look at, as I mentioned, like Dharma 14.5%, I think it was. I'm curious to see what it moves to in the absence of subsidies.
I think their subsidies just ended, by the way.
Did they?
Yep.
On Dharma?
Interesting.
Yep.
Yeah, they mentioned that.
And then it's a fixed time period loan, so I'm sure it'll take some time to propagate as well.
One interesting thing actually to talk about is tracking when big chunks of Dharma loans will mature and potentially bringing a lot of DAI back into circulation.
Yeah, especially if the subsidies just ended, I'm sure you'll have a wave coming up. I guess in, what are they, 3 months?
I think 3 months.
There were 28-day loans and there were also 90-day loans.
Does anybody know of any analytics tools for what's going on with Libra right now?
I mean, LoanScan does have some stuff, but
Is it just for
I'm
Dharma
sure
or for Libra as well?
it's just for Dharma.
So I know that there was some large capital moving into Libra, and presumably that's all going to come out at the same time. So it'd be nice to know when that's going to happen.
Agree. This is all really great stuff to watch out for. But sorry, just to answer the question real quick, in terms of the question was about the secondary lending platform rates and sort of, is that a natural or healthy buffer in terms of Maker being more expensive? I mean, if you look at compound rate, it's a pretty organic situation. There's no subsidies going on there. It is similarly a non-fixed time period loan. So I think it's a pretty good data point to look at least one of the best ones out there right now. And I think what we've seen is there is this kind of natural buffer that tends to form after the maker stability fee had come up, above a certain point. There was, and enough time was given to propagate. There was this buffer that started to form between the maker stability fee and the compound rate. And there's no artificial short-term pressure that I can think of that would cause that to happen and then later reverse. It seems to be a pretty natural trend. And I'm curious if there's disagreement on that.
Well, I don't know if maybe if I'm framing this correctly or not, but wouldn't the pressure be like the risk of the rate changing? So like that spread, that 3% buffer is really just like people trying to judge like the length at which they're willing to deploy capital on either side, or pay back capital or hold capital.
But there's no fixed time period on compounds, so it would just, those rates would move accordingly. So I don't think that would be a factor for people, is the short answer. What I do think is interesting is if you look at supply versus borrow volume on some of these, like compound in particular, there is always been like a very healthy difference between, sorry, not healthy is actually the wrong word. There's just been a significant difference between the amount that's being supplied on there and the amount that's being borrowed, which is really interesting because presumably people purchase that DAI, are eating the cost of capital, and are just keeping it sitting on there. And there's, right in the last month or so, there's been roughly 3 to 4 million DAI that people have just kept parked on compound that has never been taken up into a loan, that they're not earning any money on.
Isn't that a function of like the compound, like the formula that they use? Like they want to ensure a float there, because once the float gets smaller, the borrow rates get higher, and then subsequently like the supply rates get higher.
Aren't they getting the supply rate? Vishesh, what do you mean they're not getting any?
So you only receive unless I'm misunderstanding how compound works, you only receive the supply rate if your loans are taken up. They actually have to.
Isn't it just a giant bucket?
Yeah, it's a bucket. You get the supply rate no matter what. And like the borrow rate is always higher than the supply rate. Like right now, I think the borrow rate's like 18% or something, or 16%.
So the borrow rate is going to track closely to the stability fee, because there's that arb there, right, where you could just borrow from MakerDAO and lend it on wait.
Well,
the borrow rate will track closely because of the demand from basically speculators for what they're willing to pay to borrow. But the supply rate is obviously factors in. I mean, they definitely
the whole thing is the supply bucket takes all of the revenue from the borrow bucket and splits it amongst itself. So it doesn't matter if your DAI is actually borrowed. There's going to be a float of DAI sitting in compound that's never borrowed, that's meant to be there, and that float is like literally just correlated with that spread on the borrow supply interest rate.
But even in that scenario, it just doesn't make sense to me why like there would be this additional risk factor that creates 3 or 4% buffer between the maker stability rate and the borrow rate on compound.
Sorry, just to jump in, I'm thinking about what you just said, David, that you basically, if you're gonna buy the DAI off the open market and then put that in compound instead of taking it directly from a CDP. And what I started thinking was, well, if you've got $1 million that you want to deploy, to put that in a CDP, you need $1.5 million to get $1 million DAI out. But if you buy $1 million on the open market, then you can go straight to compound and lend that at the rate.
Yeah.
So you have that 50% difference on how much capital you actually need to get the rate that you want, to get the spot rate.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, suppliers in secondary lending markets, like it doesn't make sense for them to source DAI out of CDPs if they're projecting that their cost on borrowing is going to be higher than their revenue on supplying, or their profit from supplying. So it really makes the most sense for savers and for people that just want that passive sort of low risk revenue stream. Yeah. It's just a different segment of the market. It's just a different group of people, different group of capital.
Well, you're kind of like, if you've got, I can't do the math in my head right now, but basically if you have to pay 17, or you're getting whatever 17% on, you know, 1.5 million, that's quite a bit different than 17% on 1 million of capital.
Yeah, but I'm a little confused what you're saying, because in like the case where you're borrowing the DAI, you're paying that 17%, well, 19.5%, right? And like whatever the stability fee is, like there's nobody who's actually lending that DAI. It's just you know, the stability fee gets burned in MKR. But on Compound, if you have $1 million and like the supply rate is 8% or whatever, what we're seeing right now, listen, that's 80 grand a year on your million. And if you have 1.5 million, guess what? That's you know, 80 grand plus 40, that's 120.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes more sense.
Yeah, if you have 1.5 million and DAI, dude, you're making money on Compound. And DYDX is also a pretty, yeah, Mateo has been mentioning in the chat that DYDX is seeing a lot of volume as well. And I noticed that the supply rates have been consistently higher than Compound on DYDX. And Vishesh, I think that it's worth tracking DYDX supply and borrow rates. I think the supply rate is more consistent than the borrow, but I don't know.
Yeah, they've been exploding recently. It's interesting.
Yeah, I
to
saw
watch.
like, yeah, I saw like 30% like several times throughout the week. I was like, damn. Wish I had 1.5 million.
What keeps the borrow and supply rate on Compound from converging closer to each other?
So I think it's the way that they coded it, because they're always, the less the spread, the higher the borrow rate is pushed up. So like if there's a lot of people borrow, like if there's a smaller spread between the the borrowing volume and the DAI supplied, then the borrow rate jumps up, and so the supply rate jumps up, and more people are incentivized to jump in and supply DAI on that platform. So there's just like, I think it's just the way that it's coded.
Yeah, if you watch those two rates, they're like, there's a clear like mathematical relationship between the two.
Right, but my question is like, how is that derived? Like, how did they set it?
I don't know Compound's like internal algorithms for setting the rate.
They've posted it publicly. It's somewhere.
It's interesting though, because there's a corollary there for the stability fee and the DSR though, right? They have a cleaner, less complex system, but there's the same general principle at work, I think.
Yeah, definitely some lessons to be learned from what some of these other platforms are doing. I mean, I think that buffers has decreased as the Maker stability fee has increased, is one point. Which is interesting.
Once we get DSR, does that start to confuse what stability fee should be looking like? Like the correlation between DSR and stability fee, because we've got two variables to tweak at that point.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
So when we go to multi-collateral DAI, we're gonna have stability fee for each collateral and DSR, which I believe is global. Is basically risk team only going to be setting stability fees, and we kind of forget about those as general governance, and then DSR is what we float around to hold the peg?
No, I think there's definitely going to be governance on both, but they're going to be more tailored to what the fee represents. So I think DSR will be kind of more of a monetary policy type of tool, and the risk premium, I mean the stability fee, the collateral parameter, I think will be rebranded as the risk premium rate, and that will entail more collateral specific discussions. But ultimately there will be governance on both.
Okay, I'm just preempting sort of the idea that it's going to get real confusing real quick once we hit multi-collateral.
Yeah, it is. Um,
Well, that's actually why I was asking about that like inherent bias in having like a hard time actually lowering the fee. Like it's really easy to figure out when to heighten it, but when do you know that DAI is stable but supply is dropping? I guess like you'll start lowering it when you really see a consistent premium. Yeah, but like that might take a long time. I don't know. Yeah, I'm just thinking out loud.
No, that's a really, really good point to keep in mind, though, and I'm going to stress this multiple times, it's an asymmetric system, so it's not the same to raise something versus lower it. And like, especially when you start to think about some of those discussions that were had around debt ceiling and all of that is like the perfect example. Just because you wind something up doesn't mean you can undo the same steps to unwind it. And I think that's particularly true with something like DAI, where it's got sort of this inherently different economics above and below $1.
Yeah, and if you guys watched last week's call, for those of you that are here, Matthew Rabinowitz, he talked a bit about like what it would look like for us to do like the ideal balance between the stability fee and the DSR, and that initially it'll be high and like we should work to iterate it downwards. But again, that's it's theoretic and it's just thinking out loud.
all I know is when MCD launches, Rich is not going to sleep for months due to governance.
Yeah, we're gonna have to get him a bigger canteen for his coffee.
Coffee, he's going to need something stronger than coffee.
It's diminishing returns on coffee.
Yeah, I've already hit the diminishing returns.
But I do want to touch on a serious point real quick, which is what do we manage towards, right? So what do we look at? What's the guiding like North Star, especially as the system becomes way more complicated? Because we can envision a lot of great complicated systems about how we manage this, but in my experience, the simplest, like most constant guiding principle is going to get you, 80–90% of the way there. And right now what I'm thinking is you want to manage up the DAI supply with DAI operating at or around $1 in the long term, right? So if you have both of those things happening, if DAI is growing and it is stable, that is good. And I think
that's a really interesting point, though, because
Yeah.
it's right now we're hyper focused on a stability fee because we have this hard cap of whatever 100 million or a sweet spot of 80 circulating. But we also need to take into account competition and adoption in the MCD world. So that's a great point for sure.
I was gonna say exactly that. Like market share for stable coins is something that we should be cognizant of.
No, I don't think so. I don't buy that at all, to be honest. I think the real
such a contrarian.
I think the real debate is going to be on actually what Vishesh just kind of he casually threw together two conflicting points about keeping DAI stable and growing the DAI supply at the same time, when those two notions may not work in tandem very well at all. I mean, it's easy to grow the DAI supply, right? Just lower the stability fees and
well, you're simplifying things. So like the DAI supply is a result of an ecosystem full of actors, and like we're just one tiny part of it, right? Like business development, the wider DeFi space, crypto in general builds up the supply. We need to make sure that we're not inhibiting that, right?
Right, but I'm saying you could just increase the debt ceiling on ETH and put the stability fee at 0, and then DAI supply would grow.
But I agree. I agree with Cyrus. Like, I just want to be clear. I agree with Cyrus. I don't agree that Cyrus disagrees with me. So I agree that DAI supply and DAI price are often like in direct conflict with each other. But that's kind of my point, is there exists theoretically this proper balance of growing the supply slowly and steadily while keeping DAI at $1 in the like medium to long-term timescale. And when both of those things are happening in tandem, I think that is excellent. When DAI supply is relatively steady and DAI price is relatively steady at $1, I think that's pretty good.
But
even we maintain tension between DAI supply and the stability fee in our ecosystem, and we balance that tension against the wider market demand, though, right?
But even that, if you naively assume that the total stability fee is this sum of the DSR and the risk premium rate. If you just set all the risk premiums to 0 and then just set the DSR such that DAI is still equal to $1, then you will exponentially grow the DAI supply, because we're essentially taking on risk for no reward.
But I'm not sure that scenario would even be possible. Like, I'm not sure that's a realistic scenario to construct.
Sure it is. Why not?
Because in that situation, like, there's a question of like, what is the actual supply of DAI there as well, with respect to the DSR. But in that scenario, either one of two things, like realistically, the supply of DAI is actually not what you think it is, or like DAI is actually not going to be able to stay at $1.
The supply or the demand, though, right? Because let's say a global DSR of 5% keeps DAI stable. No matter what collateral assets are in the portfolio, 5% will keep it stable. And then you have two assets, a risky one and a high risk and a low risk one. If they both have the same overall stability fee, then people will just keep borrowing off of the riskier one.
And locking that DAI up in the DSR, you're saying? Or a good portion of it?
Not necessarily locking it up in the DSR, but they're basically taking advantage of lower rates through MakerDAO than they could get elsewhere for that same asset.
So I guess there's three questions here. And the third I'm just going to jump to, which is, okay, if not that, then what is your definition of success, which I'm really curious about. But the first two is, if there are 5 DAI and those 5 DAI are equal to $1, is that success? And then the second question is, if all the DAI that's out there is actually just locked up in the DSR and DAI is trading at $1, is that success?
Right. So I think success is keeping DAI stable while maximizing the risk reward frontier.
Can you clarify what you mean by maximizing the risk reward frontier?
So because you have to factor in the financial incentives for the MKR holders, right? So they have this incentive to keep DAI stable but maximize the buy and burn.
Right, but that's my point. Maximizing buy and burn is it's an equation, and one of the variables in that equation is the total amount of DAI being drawn and wiped.
Yeah, and I think not only that, it's also the scaling of the total DAI supply and the scaling of demand for DAI.
Right, but I'm saying you can optimize for increasing draw and wipe at the cost of having extra latent risks in your collateral that you're not factoring in. That's exactly my point. Is you can take some junk grade bond and assign it a really low risk premium, and then you'll have enormous borrowing against it because it's so cheap to borrow against what's typically a risky asset.
So I don't think that's unreasonable, right? If the simple answer is there's no simple answer, but not to be cute. Like, if the answer is that we should think about the overall growth and scale of Maker as a system and the amount of DAI that's being transacted, the amount of DAI that's being drawn and wiped, and we think about DAI being stable, and we think about systemic like health risks
right
in the system, like that is, if that's the answer, is just add a third kind of category we're not thinking about, which is what is the systemic risk. I think that's totally reasonable. I'm just trying to get to like, what is a good definition of success?
Right. So yeah, all I'm saying is that definition of success is not necessarily DAI is at $1 and there's a trillion DAI in circulation. It's actually DAI is at $1 and there's a very healthy collateral pool. Now the goal is to maximize the DAI supply given a healthy collateral pool.
Yep.
Yeah, that's
all right. Sounds great.
Right on. Yeah.
All right, well, that's everything got spicy, which is nice. And Cyrus got filled with life, which is also good to see as well. But we're at the 10:30 mark. I need to jump into another meeting, so I have to stop the recording. So if anybody wants to hang out, they're super free to do that. But
This is going to be fun to summarize.
it's all going off the record at this point.